This broadcast of the Hamptons Institute at Guildhall is being brought to you by Bridgehampton National Bank.
Welcome. I'm Ruth Appelhoff, the Executive Director of Guildhall, and thank you for coming here on this beautiful day. We truly appreciate your support and participation. We are delighted that you've chosen to join us for the second annual Hamptons Institute Summer Program. Encouraged by the enthusiastic response we received over the past year, we look forward to another top-notch event. The program addresses a wide array of important affairs, subjects from the arts to the economy, foreign affairs, politics, and the media. I'm especially grateful to the 20 experts who will join us over the next couple of days to share their insights and expertise in their various fields. Thanks especially to the Roosevelt Center, the Roosevelt Institute, for their dedicated collaboration, and thanks to the Tarr family for their continuous generous support. Also, our appreciation to Chubb Insurance and their cornerstone agent, Dayton, Ritz, and Osborne, for lead corporate sponsorship of the Hamptons Institute. I'm grateful to Ellen Chesler, whose contribution as a brilliant program director could never be surpassed. Thank you, Ellen, very, very much. And to Mickey Strauss for his inspiring leadership. I think here's where we give the applause. And also, I wanted to mention Tracy Marshall, who is our program coordinator and who has done a magnificent job pulling all of this together. Thanks to WVVH, our local media sponsor. All of these panels will be available through Guildhall's website and on YouTube. Please join us for coffee in the Minicus Garden after this session, and again at 6 p.m. for the cocktail reception following the panel Jobs, Debt, and China. During the breaks, please take a moment to enjoy the exhibitions in the galleries, sculpture by Brian Hunt and photographs by Clifford Ross. Now, I'm delighted to present the first panel, The Producers, led by Bob Balaban, who will be joined by Jeffrey Sellers, Roy Furman, and Daryl Roth. Please welcome actor, director, producer, Guildhall member of the Board of Trustees, Bob Balaban.
Hello. Thank you for coming on this gorgeous day. It's a shame we couldn't just take the roof off and be outside and inside at the same time, but we can't. I'm supposed to say a couple of things about being a producer, which I sort of am in one of my different lives. But we have three fantastic producers here to talk with us today. And here they are. You came out. There we go. Yes. This is Roy Furman over there. Hey. Daryl Roth in the middle. Hi. And Jeffrey Seller. Good afternoon. Now, the thing about being a producer, which they will all tell you, and we're going to be very informal, and please, everybody, interrupt me immediately as soon as I say something wrong, which will be likely, I'm sure. But these three people are distinguished by something that I think all great producers have, which is the ability to do anything necessary to get the thing done. When I was a kid, I had a grandfather who was a producer in Hollywood, and I remember being 10 years old and saying to him, what does a producer do exactly? I'm not sure, he could never tell me exactly what a producer did, and then I, years later, came up with my own definition. He gets the thing done, or she gets the thing done. And that's pretty much what it is. But one of the things that these three people share is a passion and an instinct for what they love. Because tell me if I'm wrong or right about this thing. When I look at you and other successful producers, I don't see people running around trying to figure out what somebody else is going to like. Like, what can we put on this year that, will make a lot of money that people will come to? What I do notice the three of you having is, what do you strongly respond to, and what are you passionate enough about to spend a year or two or three of your life, or more? In the case of Rent, I imagine it was a fair amount more, right? What do you care enough about? And if you care enough about it, probably somebody else will. Is that how you, in terms of the three of you, is that would you say that's the biggest factor in determining what it is you're going to do, that you get excited about it and care about it?
I'll lead off. I would say that absolutely you have to be passionate about the piece that you choose to produce, because so much goes into it to make it happen, as anyone will tell you, that if you don't love it deeply and feel that it's something important that you want to devote your time and energy to, it's really not worth it. And you can never count on the financial component. I mean, you can get really fortunate, ta-da, and really have a wonderful, exciting commercial hit. But I think none of us go forward thinking that that's the only motivation. Certainly, I'll speak for myself. I don't go forward thinking that's the motivation that I'm after. I certainly want to do well by my investors, and I want it to be successful. But I feel that theater deals in a different currency. And in fact, loving what you do and loving what you choose to do is the value, is the joy.
Roy, I know that you did a lot of different things before you went into the theater.
And still do.
And still do, yes. How did you get started being a producer? And did your background in finance and banking how much does that have to do with your success now as a producer?
I came into the business in the most peripheral manner. I invested in a show. Absolutely, I remember it was absurd, person singular. Alan Ayckbourn's play of probably 25 years ago, maybe more now, and put a very small amount in because I've always loved theater. And ultimately, the amount that I put in grew over time. And at some point, it reached a sufficient amount of dollars that I actually said, why am I just giving someone else money? Why don't I get involved myself, not having any idea that I could do it or understand it well enough? But that's how I sidled into the business. And the ability to understand finance has proven to be very helpful. It's not why I got involved. I love the art more than the financial side. But understanding a balance sheet, understanding real numbers, not just the printed numbers, but understanding numbers and having them talk to me makes it easier for me to respond to suggestions made, and also sometimes is helpful to the other people in the room who don't have the same background, and they tend to defer to somebody who does, which is nice, even if I'm wrong.
I can attest to that. I've produced with Roy on several occasions, and when he's around the table, you always have a very sound voice of reason vis-a-vis, do these numbers make sense? Because sometimes numbers are just numbers. And you can't really count on how many audience members are going to walk in the door of the theater. But he's always very wise about that.
What you learn is that most people don't understand what the numbers really mean. You're given sheets of paper.
Numbers.
Most of you out there, the same thing. You often get approached to do things of any kind, investments, even understanding government forms or whatever it may be. Most people just can't handle them. And they look at them and they sort of nod off or say yes and move on. And there are very few people who really are conversant enough to let the numbers mean something.
Well, also, I think rarer even are the number of people who understand numbers and are creative. I mean, it is somewhat of a divide. The people who are in creative arts don't tend to be mathematicians and bookkeepers, and yet there certainly are. And you certainly were great at numbers, I think, Jeffrey. Yeah.
Oh gosh, that's my least favorite thing to talk about. But well, here's the deal. By the 4th grade, I was writing plays and doing them with my friends, and by the 7th grade, I was going around to the local merchants to solicit them to place an ad in the program where they'd give me their business card for $20 in return. So, I like to say that when people say, how did you become a producer? I started by raising money in the 7th grade for my local theater troupe by soliciting businesses to give us money for our plays. And all I can say is that's the beginning of me counting the numbers. And it just kept on going from there.
And Jeffrey comes to New York right out of University of Michigan, yes? Did you major in theater?
No, I was a liberal arts student who majored in poli-sci, but I did theater nonstop for, all through college. And I was a performing arts supervisor at the local Jewish Federation camp in Detroit. So during college, I was in plays and directing and producing plays and teaching theater all through. And in fact, that's also how I made my money to help pay my expenses.
How did you meet the Weislers? Yes, you came to New York and started working for a very famous producing company. I'm sorry?
It's a good question.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, my first job was working for the Broadway producers Barry and Fran Weisler. And when I first got to New York 25 years ago, I worked in a small PR firm for about 10 months. And when I came to New York, I didn't even know, I didn't know what the jobs were other than actor, director, producer. I didn't know what a company manager was. I didn't know what the publicists did. I didn't know what the advertising, you know, I knew that there were all those things, but I didn't know how to get in. And then I had heard the Weislers had a job opening to be a receptionist. And I had read about the Weislers in Detroit because at the time they were going to produce Carrie, and they were the producers of the Cabaret revival with Joel Grey, and they had done Zorba with Anthony Quinn.
Were they doing Grease at this time? Or
No, this is before Grease even. This is the Macbeth Cabaret years. The Macbeth with Christopher Plummer and Glenda Jackson, where they literally threw away the set and the director and got a whole new production in Pittsburgh on the road before they got to New York. In any event, so I went to go have an interview with Fran, and this is an interesting thing about the numbers, because she said, well, you know nothing about the theater, but it's not your fault, you're only 22. And then shortly after, she said, well, are you good with numbers? And I said, well, I took statistics at Michigan. And she said, that's a class. And I said, well, I can balance my checkbook. And she said, well, that's not hard until you're rich. And I said, well, I thought when you're rich, your accountant does it for you. And then she said, has anyone ever said you're too aggressive? I got the job. And I adore her 25 years later.
And you book shows throughout the country, right? Yes?
Yeah,
you
so
book
I wound
national
up
tours?
being a booking agent for Barry and Fran, and the booking agent is the worst job on Broadway, but you can make a living, if not a killing. And the booking agent is the intermediary between the producer who produced the show in New York and the presenter in Cleveland, Denver, Columbus, Sacramento, who presents it on their local Broadway subscription series.
So you got familiar with a lot of nuts and bolts that it could have taken. You can't study this in school. Yes.
No, they throw you into it. My third day on the job, I was asked to negotiate commissions for credit cards, and I had no idea what that was. And I wound up giving the local promoter in Cleveland, Sam Lahamadou, 10% on credit cards, and they almost killed me because that was 6% more than he should have gotten. But I learned.
And you stayed for a while.
Yeah, I was with the Weislers for 3.5 years.
Now, I'm going to ask all of you, we're coming back to Rent in about 2 seconds. Daryl, how did you find your way into producing? What in you, did you know you wanted to be a producer before, or did you just love theater?
I just love theater. I didn't know what a producer was, even if that was a job. I mean, when I was growing up, I was lucky enough to have parents who adored the theater, and they would take my sister and meet at the theater all the time, and I just looked at it and wondered, how did that happen? You know, how does all that happen? And I was fascinated by it, but I didn't know for many years that there might be a place for me. So I just went about my life, and I have 2 fabulous children.
And you produced a producer.
I produced a wonderful producer and a wonderful social worker, my daughter. But that's later. I'll tell you about that later. So I started my producing career actually by will, I would say. I willed it to happen. I wanted it to happen so badly. I went to a couple of meetings at City Center at the time. I was asked by the late Howard Squadron to be on the board of City Center, and they were starting a wonderful program which ultimately became Encores. And I was asked to work on that because they knew I loved theater. And Richard Maltby was the committee chair. And Richard and I got along famously. And he asked me one day if I'd like to come down and hear some songs that he and his writing partner, David Shire, were doing at a club called 88's. 88 Piano Keys, no longer with us, but a great little club from the village. And I said, oh my God, I'd love to, thinking, this is it. I went to this little club and I loved the songs. And I said to Richard and David, couldn't this be like a theater piece? It's telling stories, it's beautiful music and songs, and most of the songs were about going through life chapters, which obviously was exactly where I was. And I said, would you let me try to do something with this? And for many reasons, probably first among them is that nobody else asked them if they could do something with it. They said, yeah. And I called a friend of mine at Williamstown Theater, and I said, Richard Maltby and David Shire have this wonderful new piece that they've asked if I could help produce. And they said, well, that's really interesting because we have a slot available. And then I realized, oh, maybe this could happen. And I just felt that, you know, the sea was parting in all the ways that it was meant to. And I just forged ahead. I've often said that I think my career is like the Nike commercial. You know, I just did it. I had no training in theater other than loving it and reading plays from the time I, you know, was old enough to read. I would much prefer to read a play than a book. And that started me off. And that piece was Closer Than Ever. And Closer Than Ever came to the Cherry Lane Theater in 1988, 89.
Wonderful piece.
Yeah, thank you. We're actually bringing it back to the York Theater this year.
Wow.
Yeah, and so that's what started me off. And I felt I learned the most important lesson. I had hired a general manager to work with me because when you talk about the artistic side and the business side, oftentimes there are two people that need to come together to do that. I feel I'm much more on the artistic side than the business side, and so I always work very closely with a general manager. And the general manager said after the reviews came out, which were mild, shall we say, not over the top fabulous, but some people loved it, and some of them were just not nice. And he said to me, I know. I said, well, we just have to really work hard to get people in because I was there every night and I could see the audience was loving it. And he said to me, no, 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 you have to close it. And I said, what? Close it? You know, no, I didn't do this to close it. I did this to produce it. And it ran for 9 months. And it was a wonderful opportunity for me to learn to find my voice and to believe that, you know, what I really felt was happening, the audiences were growing, people were liking it, you know, follow that. And that was my first.
One thing, I think it might be helpful to the audience to understand something because we're about to get so immersed in this production side. There are all kinds of people who are, quote, producers on Broadway. And I know the people on this side of the room abhor the fact that there is no real discrimination made between people who write a check and consider themselves and call themselves producers and those people who actually produce. And it's worth you understanding that basically when the producer puts together the show, finding the product, the material, the general manager, the actors, the director, everything that makes it happen, one of the other constituents that are needed are the people who have the money to help support the vision. And all the work is done, let's say, by Jeff and Daryl. They do all the work, they find the money, somebody writes them a check, and poof, each of them is considered a producer. And most of you don't know the difference and can't know the difference because no one has a sign saying, I'm the real producer, and the other person says, I wrote the check. But it's a vast difference. It's, I think, hurt us as an industry terribly. I know that at least some of the people on this floor are fighting against it and trying to change the terminology. But it's worth at least understanding that there's real producing and there is writing a check producing, and they're very, very different. And
Now,
they
But both are essential.
Essential.
Both are essential.
Except, and correct me, because you may remember better than I do, but I don't remember years and years ago, did it ever say David Merrick plus Susan and Jeff and Harold and Mickey, and there were no other, he didn't want anybody's name mentioned because he was in
In those
control.
days, there were only investors. There was the producer and there were the investors. And I think that the tide has changed insofar as people that invest in plays or musicals oftentimes want their recognition, and so being an investor at a certain level gives them the opportunity to also be a producer. And sometimes that's great because you get a nice table of interesting ideas and people, and sometimes it really hinders progress.
Well, it's interesting because I've produced exactly 1 or 2 plays, but what I immediately noticed was I suddenly had to come to meetings every week that the show was running. When you say come to the table,
Right.
you are sitting around with people who are smart, interested, informed, or insane and strange, but they got to sit there anyway, and you can't shut them up. I guess it's like being in Congress. I guess
You can shut them up, and Mr. Seller has a very good way of shutting them up, which is you have fewer meetings. That's what Jeff does, and each producer does it their own way to mitigate the price of having all these people What I object to primarily is just that they represent themselves to the outside world as the producer of the show. And where I think it hurts the business is many of them are not able to really produce, but they get empowered to produce because they have the names of the shows they've been involved with, and people will give them money because, hey, they produced Wicked, they produced Hair and Rent, and a lot of other shows which they didn't, in fact, really have much to do with. And I think it does have a tendency to sort of blur the image.
Well, the movie business has, of course, the exact same phenomenon, and finally came up with a solution that sounds great, but it doesn't work at all either, so don't do this. Because in the movie business, everybody who says they're a producer, and you specifically cannot be called a producer of the movie if all you did was give money, which is, you know, sometimes you shouldn't, sometimes you shouldn't, I suppose. But they did make a rule that at the end of it all, there's a little secret sheet of paper that gets distributed amongst everybody who worked on the movie, including the other producers, but also many of the department heads, because the department heads are who know who really ran the thing while it was going on. And everybody writes their very impassioned statement saying, this is what this person did, this person says they did that, but they didn't really, and they digest this whole thing, and they usually come back and just call everybody a producer. So it's not terribly effective.
Well, I would like to put an addendum on this for theater, though, because theater, I have to say, I agree with you, but it's really important when you're out raising money, especially for very challenging plays, to be able to make it happen. And if the end result is to see the vision on stage, and if it means that you have to ask people for money and they'll only give it to you if they have credit in the play, you know, in the playbill on the poster, I say it's only ink, in a way. And you want it to happen, right? And oftentimes you'll find somebody who's just terrifically wonderful and energetic and wants to help you make it, you know, spread the word. And so it's not all bad, is I guess all I want to say.
All I meant was I just think it's important for people to understand there is a difference.
Yeah,
and I, by the way, do both. I write checks for some where I have no involvement, and I am a lead producer where I am very active on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis.
It depends on the project.
And the projects change. Jeffrey and I did West Side Story together. It would be misrepresenting it to say that I had much to do with West Side Story. And Jeffrey was the lead producer, co-lead producer, and I was there and trying to help as much as I can, because I do try to do that, but I don't walk around representing to people, I produced West Side Story, and I think that is the difference. If you just knew enough to say, I'm an investor in the show, and I get producer credit, et cetera, but don't take credit for.
Right, that's a different issue.
That's what I don't like.
Saying.
That's my concern.
But I think people will be
Moving
people, and some people just want credit.
Moving on.
They just do. How did you start, Roy? What was your first production?
First production that I was actually involved with was Kiss Me Kate, the revival of Kiss Me Kate with.
It was great. I love that. That's the
Roger,
the amazing dancer,
Yeah.
boy dancer, danced from the bottom of the stage to the top on the fire escape.
So
it was
he did.
phenomenal.
Michael Barres.
He was
Michael
great.
Barres.
right.
Friend.
And he was terrific, and Stokes and Marin,
Yeah.
Marin Maisie, and it was a wonderful experience. What I've ended up doing as a result, it's interesting, never having expected to be a producer, it was never in my life's thought, unlike Jeffrey. I have made it my goal, though, to try to be a producer of every one of the greatest musicals of my lifetime in revival. And I set a goal to try to do that. As I got involved in it more, I said, gee, the idea, because these were parts of my legacy growing up. And I said, if I could be involved, these were the shows that I would love to do. And one of them was obviously West Side Story, which was anthemic to me when I was growing up. And another one was Gypsy. So every time I hear the rumor that there might be a revival of one of these, I pounce on it to get involved as much as I can.
And how exciting it must have been for you to have Arthur Lawrence involved with your production, yes?
It was great, even though he was a pain.
What was he, 93 at the time?
He was 92, and
Yeah, he was 91 at the time. He would yesterday would have been his 94th birthday. Arthur died, as many of you may know, in I think April or late March.
But that's,
Well, Arthur, frankly, doing it for me was the biggest motivation to do it, because I don't seek out revivals, but when Arthur called my business partner Kevin and I and said, please come and talk to me, I would like to do this with you, it seemed to me that this was a unique opportunity for my career to be able to do one show with one of the creators of the modern musical as we know it today. And then to a smaller extent, because Steve wasn't that involved, with two of the creators of the modern musical as it is today, Arthur and Steve Sondheim.
I felt very much like that in the play world with Larry Kramer and The Normal Heart.
Yeah.
I felt for me it would be,
Bravo to that.
oh, thank you. I felt very, very much as, in that way that, you know, this would be my opportunity to sort of give his gift to the world in the way that your revival of West Side Story did.
Daryl did an amazing thing, which you probably mostly know or you wouldn't be sitting here listening to all of us. But Daryl, I think without the intention necessarily of doing the production, did a reading of The Normal Heart a year ago, 8 months ago? Not that long ago.
October.
Okay.
In October.
Last October. Did a reading that so excited you and everybody who was there that you decided you absolutely had to put this on as a play, even though it was a very dangerous thing to do, yes?
Yes. It was so clear to me after that reading that it had to happen. It just had to happen. It was simple and it was clear. And I felt that young people had to see the play, and I felt that people that were involved in the, you know, in the AIDS epidemic in the 80s needed to see the play and sort of have a different remembrance from afar, from time passing, you know, absorb it differently. And, you know, having a young gay son, it was important for me to know that his generation understood the legacy, because it was really surprising and frightening that after the reading, so many young people that were there, that were just brought there because it was a very starry cast and it was wonderful, didn't know what exactly they were in for, had no idea of the history and the legacy. So that was my motivation to do it, and to be able, I sort of feel like I was the messenger.
Well, it was quite amazing. We talked a couple of times as this was happening, and correct me if I'm wrong, you had 2 weeks of rehearsal, yes? 18 days, something?
Horrifyingly true, yes.
The cast was not even necessarily going to learn their lines. They were kind of going to go around holding their books and doing the play in this gorgeous, simple set.
Yeah.
And
David Rockwell designed.
yeah, gorgeous thing.
Yeah.
And somehow, I must have seen, what, the 5th preview? There weren't that many previews.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't sat in a theater and seen a play in a really long time that I was that excited about. And it was something that I shared with the audience, what your difficulty, I think, in communicating to the audience. This was not a lecture. This was a living, breathing, really amazing production of something that deserved to be seen as drama. And of course, it was so socially significant. But I imagine people got afraid of its significance. Was that a problem?
I think initially people were afraid. Maybe they just didn't want to enter the world that they knew was an unhappy time. But once the word of mouth started going around, it was just too good to miss. You know.
There's a great illustration by way of wonderful producing, which I've told you already.
Thank you.
But Daryl did just a sensational job, and it's what a producer does, puts it together from whole cloth and runs with it as it moves along. It changed, it was all the iterations of it, and Daryl was on top of it and made it happen.
Thank you for saying
Got a
that.
theater that wasn't supposed to be a theater.
That's why we had 2 weeks rehearsal. We didn't have a theater. And, you know, you wanted to get it in before the Tony deadline. That was the reason for the
You
crush.
made it by a minute, right?
We made it by 2 days, actually. And so we were able to do it if we could do it in 2 weeks. And everybody that signed on said, we can do it. We may be on book, but we can do it. And I said, that's fine, you know. We'll start off on book and see where it goes. But it was really interesting because there was such a drive and such a passion that everybody felt, all of us felt. I mean, David Rockwell designed the set in like a nanosecond. And the sound and the lights and the actors and everything that happened under George Wolfe's direction was just from such a deep place. I've never seen anything like this of all my 24 years.
I was afraid when I saw it because I thought, well, it must be this good because they just learned their lines. It's so fresh.
I think maybe it was.
There was something about it.
I think maybe it was.
Well, but my friends who went the next month had
But
the
then it
exact
got better
same
and
reaction.
deeper and more passionate and more powerful. But the truth is, something that you said is very interesting. People were able to view this as a wonderful work of writing, a great play. It wasn't seen that way in the beginning. It was really more of a political polemic.
A polemic.
And it wasn't viewed as the beautiful writing that it is, which is nice.
And you really gave a gift, as Larry Kramer this has changed his life
I
dramatically.
would say.
To be
He's the
understood, I
happiest
think to be
person.
understood finally, yes?
Yeah. Well, fortunately, he hasn't really mellowed that much, which is just
Mhm.
great.
Didn't he
You
used
know,
to-
he's still feisty.
Was he kind of outside the theater collecting signatures and
He was giving
agitating?
out letters. He was not collecting signatures. He was giving out a letter that he wanted people to know in true Larry Kramer fashion. It was, you know, it was kind of telling people how they have to live to be safe and to be healthy.
Well,
Yeah.
he didn't
That's
want
what
to
he
miss the
does.
opportunity to reach people.
And he was there in the beginning when it was chilly. He wore this orange parka, and people would go, and some people didn't recognize him. They say, "Who's the guy in the orange parka?" He was just standing in the crowd as the theater let out, handing out letters.
Well,
Yeah, it was good. It was good.
Roy, as somebody whose ambition it is to reproduce great musicals that are anthemic, you also happen to have produced some amazingly current, fresh, brand new, amazing musicals, which you know because you know what he's done. But how amazing is it to have, in one lifetime, both produced Spamalot and Book of Mormon? I mean, how does that lightning strike twice?
And the Addams Family,
And the Addams
and
Family.
the Addams Family,
And the Addams Family.
And the Addams Family.
not to be forgotten.
Thank you, thank you. It's been forgotten by many, but
No, but that's a whole. But with the Addams Family, I'm almost saving for another talk about how amazingly it has turned out.
I would tell you that Book of Mormon represents this sort of midpoint between what I was saying about producing and pretending to produce. Scott Rudin was the producer of the Book of Mormon, and he's done a brilliant job, as he usually does. And what I consider myself fortunate and at least smart enough to do was, I was one of the early ones who had a chance to look at it and fell in love with it. And if you think that the normal heart raised problems or concern among people, the Book of Mormon was so frightening in prospect that everyone was afraid of it. And in fact, what, as usually happens, you know, success has many fathers and, you know, failure is an orphan. In Broadway today, almost everyone touched somebody and they say, "I can't believe I missed out on Book of Mormon." That's the one thing they say to you. I could have, I should have, I would have. But the fact is, it was frightening. It is blasphemous. Have many of you seen it?
Well, they can't get tickets.
That's right. I'll sell you tickets afterwards. But
get tickets.
it's scurrilous and blasphemous, and it ironically took Broadway to a position that every other art form had been in. Cable television has been there long ago, and the movies, some of these movies are so filthy, and they're the R-rated ones, not the X. But Broadway has always been relatively, I find, sacrosanct. It's much more worried about people coming from Alabama and
Theater
you know,
parties, yeah.
you know, everyone with
Well,
a
there was
theater group
Avenue
spine.
Q.
Yes, and he did Avenue Q, which broke ground.
I mean,
but-
that really broke some ground, I would say, in that department.
But
Didn't take it as far as Mormon.
Broadway's a very old-fashioned business. And ironically enough, one of the reasons I really warmed to this, I wasn't afraid of it. You get old enough that you don't worry about things like that. It didn't bother me. Ironically enough, I actually thought the one major protest we received would be from the African community, which nobody was worried about. They were worrying about, you know, the language and the Mormons and the religious people. And my concern was that Africa is painted so negatively that I was concerned, what if one of these governments, Uganda, just says, just like, this is terrible, and makes a whole stink out of it. But the fact is, Broadway is way behind the times, and I felt that as somebody with experience and maturity and some sense of judgment, it would be the right thing for me to say yes, to sign on to this, to be a, sort of a torchbearer in the very early stages and say, I'm with it, I'm going to do this, and maybe bring other people in, because it was not a project that people were throwing money at, quite the
Well,
contrary.
actually, there was a moment where there wasn't a way in. After they did the presentation, I know
Afterwards.
some people came to the presentation and they wanted to give money, and it was closed. Right after the presentation, everyone was like full up.
But in the early stages,
Earlier on.
it was doable.
There's something else also interesting and true, very true about Avenue Q as well, one of my most favorite musicals. It's very affectionate. As scatological as it is, and as blasphemous it is, there's a sweetness to it, yes? I mean,
It's
not that it would have to,
real
but
It's sweet, and it has the musical theater arc. It is, in my opinion, it is The King and I in modern day dress. And Laugh you may, but it really is. If you will remember The King and I, part of our lifetime, The King and I, Anna Leon Owens goes to Siam to tame the king and to bring him culture and awareness and whatever, and he ends up showing her a few things and teaching her about things she didn't understand, and they end up dancing together and loving each other and getting along. And these are Ugandans coming to proselytize about their way of life and the real world and the better way to these people living in squalor and all kinds of terrible things. And gradually, each one learns from the other. And it's, to me, very much the arc of A King and I. They end up loving each other and getting along together. And there isn't even a satire in the second act. There is a breathtaking number which satirizes Small House of Uncle Thomas from King and I, direct satirization of it. That is one of the funnier moments I've ever seen in theater. But that's really what I think it is. And it is a very sweet, lovely project. But the one thing I would tell you, or comment about my involvement, you don't write many notes to Scott Rudin, and you certainly don't write notes to the people who've written South Park for 15 years, telling them how to write a show. But at the very early stages, the second act wasn't there. And it was clear the first act was setting up for something that wasn't coalescing. And I sent one of my few notes to Scott. And the way the theater works is the producers who are active, and there are inactive and active, and I'm an active producer even when I'm not involved directly, send it through the chain of command, which is you go to your lead producer. You don't go to the creatives, because otherwise they get inundated by 84 yahoos who don't know what they're doing. So it's filtered through the lead. And so I sent Scott Rudin a note saying, I'm sure you're aware of this, but I just want to tell you that for my purposes, Act 2 just isn't there yet. We don't like one of the Mormons. The character isn't right. The arc doesn't work. There's just literally a paragraph. And I got a note back from Scott Rudin saying, we get it. We know it. We'll fix it. It's going to be done. That was it, 4 lines, and they did. They understood it, they saw it, and to their credit, they were able to pull it off. The irony of, the supreme irony is that on the first preview night, the guys who created it were standing in the back of the theater, incredulous, and when I asked them why they were so excited and surprised, they mentioned that this was the first product they've ever written where they had a live audience. They'd never heard their work being laughed at live. They wrote a television series and a movie, and a couple of movies. So, and they had that skill because they're steeped in musical theater, and they got it.
It is a procedural thing, and maybe if everybody knows this, I won't explain it, but I'll do it very quickly. Something that surprised me, and I've been in a lot of plays and other things for my whole life, and at some point I started directing for theater and learned that it's very, very different. The relationship between the writer and the producer and the director in theater is completely different contractually from the difference from movies. I don't know if you all know this or not, but in a nutshell, the writer has complete authority in theater, which is in movies. The joke. There are so many jokes about, I can't even say them. They're dirty jokes about it, even so I won't do it. The person who made the mistake and went out instead with the writer instead of the director of the movie.
Oh, that's very fun.
The starlet who was so unintelligent that that's what she did. But in theater, the writer is king. And it says, if you belong to the Dramatists Guild, and everybody here does, you cannot change a word that the writer writes without the writer's permission. There are also other approvals involving the scenery, even in touring, sometimes the size of the houses. That theater is so much more, the word is sacrosanct in the theater, and it's just not in movies. So all of you have had to delicately and tactfully deal with writers who could have given you a 4-hour play and refused to cut it, yes? I mean...
Well, I've worked with Edward Albee, who's probably one of the greatest living playwrights, and...
3 times, 4 times?
5 times, actually.
5 times, okay.
The first time I worked with him was 3 Tall Women, which was kind of the beginning of his return to public acceptance here in a way.
And won a Pulitzer Prize, yes?
It did. And it was a wonderful play, wonderful play. And Edward would sit in the rehearsal room for all of the plays, even Virginia Woolf, which you would think was absolutely perfect to the last comma. And he would, not change too much, but if ever he wanted to change something, it would be with great thought and he would just say to the, actors, everyone working, just a moment, please, just a moment. And he might make the slightest adjustment. I mean, here's a great living playwright, still thinking, still working in a way, or at least working in his mind, is everything working? Three Tall Women was a new play when we did it. Obviously, Virginia Woolf was a revival, but we did Beckett Albee and the play about the baby. Those were all new plays. And
how was he casting-wise? Because I've heard, especially about Virginia Woolf, there's some very famous stories about he sees the character of Martha as a very specific kind of person physically.
Yes.
So he's very rigorous about his
he's
expectations.
really he's a great casting director for his own work. He really is genius. I will tell you one thing, when we replaced Sylvia, did anyone see The Goater, who is Sylvia? That was really an interesting play. And the first cast was Bill Pullman. It's a good word for it. Interesting. Provocative. Mercedes Rule, who was wonderful, a friend of Guildhall, I know, and Bill Pullman. They were exquisite. We thought about recasting this for a while when it looked like it was going to be able to have a longer life. And one of the ideas came actually from an experience that I had watching an actor watch the play. I was watching the play one night, and Bill Irwin was sitting in the audience. And I have this image of him. He was sitting in the audience with a knapsack on his lap, with his hands over it, totally engrossed. He was totally focused. He was watching this play in a way that he was like holding on every single word. And after the play, I didn't know him too well at the time, but I went up and said, "Hello, I'm so glad you're here, and I hope you enjoyed it." He said, "It was stunning," and he left. When it was time to recast, I said to Edward, like he needs to hear my ideas, but I said, "Edward, Bill Irwin was in the theater one night, and he was so engrossed. He loves this play so much. What do you think?" And he said, "Well, bring him into audition." And he did, and he came in and he auditioned. He was so nervous, poor man. He was so nervous that he really didn't do a very good audition. But I kind of knew he had it in him, and I said to Edward, "Would you let him come back? Let him go out of the room." I mean, the poor guy was sweating. He was nervous, you could see. And he's such a fine actor. And he said, "Okay, let him go out." And he came back in, and he just nailed it. And he was the next person in the cast with Sally Field, who, by the way, was an idea that Scott Rudin had, bringing Scott back into this conversation. And Edward said, "I like it." And he just has an eye for who people should be.
But how great
he knows his characters so well.
But how great that you did that with Bill. It's something, because I act, among other things, sometimes.
Yeah.
And nobody ever says that to you. I mean, I've trained myself that when I fall on my face, to start all over again or to come back. Nobody does it for you, though. When you're doing that for him, it's a real gift.
Well, I sort of
and you
felt
got
responsible
rewarded
for
for
the
it, too.
idea. I felt, okay, I brought this up to him. I want it to be a good idea. I wanted him to think I had a good idea. And the fact is, I knew he'd be great, but he was so nervous in front of Edward Albee. It's hard to audition.
But I like that quality that you have, that when you know something can happen, you'll run the play another 4 months because you know that people love it and it should be. And a lot of people don't do that. Jeffrey, are you bored of this?
So
this must
quiet.
be
We're
like
just
Tony
talking to
Bennett
No,
singing.
I think you should ask Jeffrey, since you're talking about creative, talented writers, since we work with Arthur Lawrence, and Jeffrey was the point man with Arthur on the Spanish situation.
Oh, that was
that's
interesting.
an interesting
In West Side
thing.
Story. Jeffrey might want to elucidate on that. That
Or
was
might not.
That was 5 lifetimes in a short
Well,
period.
just to preface it, and you would say this anyway, but the idea of being in West Side Story and the new production, one of the many things was there was a lot more Spanish spoken in it, given that half the cast was supposed to be Spanish speaking. What happened?
Well, for about 9 years ago, we were going to do West Side Story, and Arthur was not going to direct it. Jerry Mitchell was going to direct it and choreograph it. And well, first of all, I'm going to try to make this as brief as I can, because the truth is I don't like revivals that much. I did West Side Story because I wanted to work with Arthur and Steve, but it's, you know, it's not where I've made my living. I've made my living doing musicals that are new. But nevertheless, when we were trying to do it 9 years ago, you know, this is sometimes what also happens, which is this author says, well, this person has to be the casting director, and this person has to be the music director, and I want this person to design it, and I want that person to do this. And I said, I'm not a valet.
Thank you.
and said, thank you very much. We're not interested in doing West Side Story. Goodbye. And walked away. And then it fell apart. And then it was 5, 6 years after that was when Arthur called Kevin and I, said, come talk to me. And he said, I have an idea for why I want to do West Side Story. And my idea is that we're going to give the Spanish to the Sharks. And how he got this idea was that his lover, Tom, who had recently died after a 50-year partnership, had seen a production of West Side Story in Colombia, and it was all in Spanish, of course, and suddenly the Sharks were the heroes.
And it made sense.
And it made sense. And he said, so why can't we make it that way here so we can level the playing field? And that was the genesis of it. And all I can say about it in summary is that when my friends, my Jewish friends from Ann Arbor, Michigan, came to see the show on Broadway several months after it opened, they said, to me, the Sharks were my mishpucha. And that justified the entire endeavor from my perspective.
That's great, very exciting. Are you, like Tony Bennett singing I Left My Heart in San Francisco, are you tired of telling the story of how Rent started when you were 10 years old?
Yeah.
Can you tell about that?
But tell it anyway.
Yeah,
because
but
it's a good story.
Yeah, I guess I'm not.
Okay.
I was looking at you like, how far do you want to go?
Well,
but because
no,
the Weislers are kind of attached to this, which was that, you know, so I was a booker for the Weislers for 3.5 years, and I hated it. But I was learning everything I needed to know, but I wanted to be a producer. And I was about 25, and I felt like my own life was like already like, oh, what am I going to do with my life? Nothing's going right. And I went to see a rock monologue that Jonathan Larson both wrote and performed off Broadway. And it was just, it was on for like 3 nights. It was called Boho Days. It eventually became a musical that did run off Broadway commercially called Tick, Tick, Boom. And I went to see this, Boho Days, which was all about a writer turning 30 and saying, should I still write rock musicals that no one will produce? Or should I hang it up and go get a job as a copywriter on Madison Avenue and finally make a living for once in my entire life? And it was Jonathan's story, set to rock music, that made the hair on my arms stand up. I felt like this guy who I've never met in my life is speaking to every issue that's going on in my life. And I was so overwhelmed by that night that I wrote him a letter the next day saying, I want to produce your musicals. And so help me God, there is no exaggeration in this. The day I was being fired by the Weislers, while my immediate boss, a woman named Susan Weaving, who takes complete credit for my career, by the way, the day that she was firing me in the conference room, I heard over the intercom Jeffrey Seller, Jonathan Larson on line 3. And, well, needless to say, I met Jonathan at a bar downtown 3 days later because I suddenly had no job. And that was the beginning of our relationship that started in 1990 and culminated with Rent in 1996 in a tragic story, because the truth of it is that he wrote Rent and died 3 hours after the dress rehearsal. And never got to see the fruits of his labor. But that was the beginning of my journey with Jonathan. And it's part of what I say to young producer wannabes who come out of college. I say, hook up with your contemporaries. When I was 25 and working with the Weislers, my best friend was Andrew Lippa, who wrote The Addams Family. And Jonathan Larson was my friend, and other writers and directors. And I always knew I was never going to produce Andrew Lloyd Webber and Stephen Sondheim. And I just was lucky enough that the guys I was hanging out with were Jonathan and Andrew.
You weren't just lucky enough. you were able to feel that certain.
Yeah,
you were able to figure out
I
stuff.
guess that was
You
innate.
could.
But those were the guys I came up with. And what I like to say is that when I met Jonathan in 1990, I was not ready to produce a musical, but he wasn't ready to write one for Broadway yet either, and we grew together. And at the moment where I was ready, he was ready. And you know, fascinatingly, I was inspired by Don Giovanni, and I had given him an idea of doing a contemporary Don Juan, and that was when he said to me this is around 91, oh, well, I want to do a modern day La Boheme. And I loved La Boheme too, and when he told me I want to do La Boheme, it's going to be in the East Village where instead of tuberculosis, it's HIV, and Mimi will have HIV, I said, well, that's a brilliant idea. And we had our first preview off Broadway last night, so it continues.
Wow. And you have, as everybody has, I guess, but you have also moved from Broadway to off-Broadway very successfully before. I know did Avenue Q begin off-Broadway? Yes?
Avenue Q began at the Vineyard.
In a not-for-profit.
Yep. And then it went to Broadway, and now it's back off Broadway, where it's been happily running for almost 2 years.
And might be the Fantastics, yes? I mean, it could be.
It could be.
Hope so.
I hope so.
We love off-Broadway, you know. Everyone thinks that theater is just Broadway. It's not.
Yeah.
There are great things happening off-Broadway.
You know, and Daryl and I worked together when I brought De La Guardia to New York in 1998, I think, and we played at the new Daryl Roth Theater.
Was that the opening show of your theater?
Yes, I was going to make it into a proper theater with seats.
That's
Actually.
right. And I came to Daryl's office and said, stop.
Well, that's not what you, but before that,
Yeah.
do you know the before that part?
I remember when David Binder said that there was a fence
Sent me-
around the theater.
He sent me
Yeah.
this video, like a 10-minute video
Yes.
of what was De La Guardia. And I remember this so distinctly because Jordan was with me. And I said, Jordan, come and watch this video with me because, you know, I think I'm too old for it, so you'll tell me what you think. And we sat down and we watched this video. And I looked at him, and he looked at me, and I said, am I crazy or is this fabulous? He said, this is fabulous. Get them in the building. Just like that. Just like that. And that was before the building was made into anything, and it's still 10 years later, this big, open, wonderful space where De La Guardia ran for 7 years.
Yeah.
And then I call it the cousin, Terza Bruta, which is there now, is running for.
Daryl has, which not that many producers have. You have 2 theaters that you own. You
Yes, I do.
have the gorgeous bank on the corner
Which
of
is where De La Guardia was.
15th Street and Union Square, which
Yeah.
is a magnificent building. I don't know if its dimensions are they
50 by
vaguely
100.
similar to this room, perhaps?
Yeah, and no structure in the way, so you have perfect view.
Think of the money she
And
saved
very
without
hot.
chairs and seats.
And no chairs. And people flying around.
But we did, Daryl, we've
And
worked
we did a
together
great
couple of
play
times.
together.
And we did a play together there.
I had the great honor of working with Bob Balaban,
Well.
who directed a wonderful off-Broadway play called Manuscript. That you found some great, talk about having a great eye for casting. You brought in Pablo Schreiber,
Yes, he was great.
Marin,
And Marin,
Marin,
what's her name?
Marin Ireland,
Yes, thank you, Marin
Yeah.
Ireland, who was brilliant.
and did a play by a new playwright.
But we made a traditional space out of this amazing theater, and it worked beautifully for the play.
We
And then
put
the next
seats
day
in.
you
We
came in
actually-
and it was
we can
gone.
put seats in,
Yes,
but they don't live there all the time. They come and go.
and what were you going to say?
I was going to just interject apropos the off-Broadway, Broadway thing that unfortunately the economic model for off-Broadway is very, very damaged. If, you know, there are exceptions, but off-Broadway has proven to be a very fertile ground for product that moves. And part of this is that the Broadway League, which is the sort of oversight nonprofit group that oversees everything going on in the theater, has powered the Broadway brand, spent a lot of money, gotten a lot of sponsorship to make Broadway a greater image. And the more they power the Broadway brand, the more it makes people come to New York and want to go to Broadway as opposed to theater. When I was growing up, and Frida, when we were younger, we always went off-Broadway. Now it's increasingly, there's so much going on Broadway, it's harder. And what Broadway does is it brands shows so that it was easier for Avenue Q to move from its, 6-year run, right?
Yes.
6-year run on Broadway, and it should never have been kicked out of Broadway, those silly people. But anyway, once Avenue Q had to leave Broadway, it was so well branded, it could open off-Broadway and succeed big time. And this now looks like a very good avenue because Rent is doing the same thing and will obviously run forever also. But starting off-Broadway and being able to sustain yourself and make a brand is extremely difficult, I would say, in today's environment.
It is difficult, but there are certain things that belong off-Broadway
Agreed.
that need the intimacy of a smaller space, like Love, Loss, and What I Wore, which has been running now for 2 years. And
Aren't you in about 15 countries as well?
we're starting our tour in Chicago in September, if anyone